Support for Trifles comes from the BSI Press. Manuscripts, collections of papers by international writers, and books covering a wide range of other Sherlockian topics. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And by listeners like you, who choose to support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 278, A Rushed Wedding. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we talk about the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, do you feel rushed?
No, I don't feel rushed at all.
Well, we're going to get through this episode in record time then.
Oh, good. Well, Any questions? It's just a trifle. Bye.
Bye. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Well, we have a fun show in store today, a little bit of a different origin there. Before we get into that, we wanted to remind you that this episode is the end of April, right? That means it is time for a drawing. So stay tuned toward the end of the show, maybe the middle of the show. Let's mix it up a little bit. We'll see where it ends up, where we will do our giveaway. This is the monthly giveaway where we give people a mystery pack of back BSJ issues. In order to qualify for this, you simply have to be a patron of Trifles, which means going to patreon.com/trifles or clicking the link in our show notes to support the show for as little as $1 a month. And we will select from all of our patrons one random person to win this prize. So stay tuned for that. Meanwhile, if you'd like to comment on this show, the show notes are available at ihose.co/trifles278, all lowercase. And you can certainly reach us on social media as I Hear of Sherlock everywhere. And if you'd like to email us, simply send us a note at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. Well, as I said, this is going to be a bit of a different episode because this is one of those wonderful times when we had a topic recommended to us by a listener.
Hooray!
Yeah, no more racking our brains and smashing our heads against walls. I was getting a flat mark on my forehead from hitting it against the wall too many times. You know, this is our 6th season, our 278th episode.
Good God.
I know, where we've had to select these topics and decide to talk about them. And I didn't realize, A, that we hadn't talked about this, and B, that this was even something to consider. So
Now, are those things in the right order? I mean, wouldn't it be the other way around? B, that this was not something to consider, and A, we haven't talked about it?
Well, absolutely. There are plenty of things that we haven't talked about that we'd never even consider.
Yeah.
And that's one.
Yeah, exactly.
One and B, yes.
Customs duties in Istanbul in 1880.
I can't even begin to imagine what that will entail.
Me neither.
Well, anyway, we got an email from Elizabeth Mason, who wrote to us, said, Scott and Burt, I love your podcast. I especially appreciated the playlist of episodes where you talked about women in the canon. I'm wondering if you can help me with a plot point in a scandal in Bohemia that's always confused me. Why did Irene Adler rush to get married. I've never understood why, in the context of the king's impending marriage, it was important for her to be married too. Thanks in advance for any insight you can impart. Ellie. Well, Ellie, thank you for that. And I really applaud your optimism that you think we can impart any insight or wisdom. But this is one of those things where we looked through the scholarship, and I looked through both annotateds that I have, the Klinger and the Baring-Gould. I looked through the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library by Les Klinger. I even looked through back issues of the Baker Street Journal through the wonderful search capability of the eBSJ. Couldn't find anything. What did that leave us with?
Well, not much. So it's just a trifle and goodbye.
We said it was going to be brief.
Actually, it left us with quite a bit because the Baker Street Irregulars, in their infinite wisdom, in their manuscript series, 11 short years ago, published a facsimile of the original manuscript of A Scandal in Bohemia, along with annotations and commentary. And it's a lovely volume. It's now quite scarce. But in there are a couple of papers that allow us to discuss this question. So the basic question, beautifully framed by our listener here, is why? Why did Irene marry? And in fact, this is not specifically addressed anywhere in Bohemian Souls, but there are a couple of interesting things going on just to set the groundwork, the context for this, from this book, Bohemian Souls. And one of them is an essay by John Linsenmeyer, a wonderful irregular, a great writer, a retired attorney. John dug into the whole actions of the marriage, not the question of the marriage, but the actions of the marriage. And basically, John, who among other things is quite a theologian himself, discusses in his essay, comes to the conclusion, makes very clear that this entire ceremony, regardless of what the perspective of which faith you happen to be looking at it from, Catholic or Anglican or otherwise, the whole thing was preposterous. The ceremony didn't make any sense. It didn't conform to the legal requirements or the customs of the time. The notations about the clergyman and what the clergyman was wearing were completely irregular. And John came to the conclusion in his essay in Bohemian Souls, that Irene Adler had constructed, and with the help of Godfrey Norton, that whole ceremony simply to mock Sherlock Holmes. Well, that's an interesting view that I did not come across before.
I like that. You've heard of a shotgun wedding. This is more like a slingshot wedding. More puerile in its intentions. But it makes you wonder, and I don't know if John covered this, if the marriage at that point was indeed legal at all.
Well, he says somewhat convincingly, and of course he is, as I mentioned, a retired attorney, that it didn't conform to any of the customs of the day, including the legal customs involving reading of the banns and the timing and so on and so forth.
Yeah, this notion of the banns of marriage, BANNS. Yeah. This is something that was required through the church, that it was a process through which a couple would go. They had to wait a certain period of time. This was in part to ensure that they both truly intended to go through with the marriage and that they conformed with the religion in which they were, the church of which they were having the sacrament of marriage performed. So it would be difficult to do all of that on the fly in a church. I mean, if It seems to me that if they wished to pull the wool over Sherlock Holmes's eyes, then perhaps they would have sought out a justice of the peace and had more of a civil marriage rather than a religious marriage.
Yeah, that's possible. So. But John's essay is a lovely thing, and I have to point out that among other things here, this is supposed to be taking place at the Church of St. Monica's in the Edgware Road. Well, John has dug into all of this around England and London and says, look, there is no church of any denomination named St. Monica's. There's no parish of that name anywhere in the Diocese of London, in the Diocese of Southwark, or the South Bank of Thames, or anywhere in all of England. But he does have a lovely observation here. For those unfamiliar with hagiography, a brief word on St. Monica herself might be in order. She was born in Tagaste in Roman North Africa in 333 AD. She died in Ostia outside Rome in 387. She's primarily famous as the mother of St. Augustine of Hippo, the great theologian, and is, incidentally, the patron saint of difficult marriages and disappointing children.
I love that.
Isn't that charming? Isn't that charming?
Why don't we take a quick break and, perform our own ceremony where we genuflect at the altar of our sponsor. One of the legacies that former head of the Baker Street Irregulars, Mike Whalen, left us is the BSI Press. The BSI Press has published more than 60 volumes related to Sherlock Holmes. These include the manuscript series, which provides facsimile editions of manuscripts and other documents relating to Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, along with insightful commentary by talented Sherlockian and Doylean writers. The latest is a masterpiece of villainy, which is a look at the Norwood Builder. The BSI Profession series examines roles played by various professions in the Sherlockian canon: law, medicine, military, education, and now music in Referring to My Notes. And the BSI International series that makes available Sherlockian scholarship in English from various countries around the world. Head on over to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and browse around the BSI Press section. There's something there for everyone. Of course, the Baker Street Irregulars also has a number of books from the BSI Press, unfortunately not including Bohemian Souls, from which we are taking our source material in this episode, but perhaps you can find it on ABE Books or from some booksellers in your area, so take a look for that. Bert, you were about to launch us into the direction of Michael Keane.
Michael Keane, our current and much beloved Wiggins, has an essay in Bohemian Souls entitled The Late Irene Adler of Dubious and Questionable Memory, and Michael lays out a dozen questions to address in his essay. And one of them, the third question, there are all sorts of questions here. Why was Irene referred to as the late Irene Adler? Why did Irene and Godfrey Norton leave London never to return? Et cetera, et cetera. But his third question is, why was the marriage of Irene Adler and Godfrey Norton so hurried? Well, to do an injustice to Michael's essay here, his conclusion, just to cut to the chase here, is that Irene was expecting. And the reason why Watson refers to her as the late Irene Adler is that sadly both she and the child died in childbirth.
Oh, that kind of late.
Yes, that kind of late.
I thought you meant.
As opposed to tardy.
Well, or certain biological things that may have been late.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, or else. Well, look, a woman in the end of the 19th century, particularly an opera singer, there are these gloves to put on. There's the jewelry, there's the costume, there's the wigs. No wonder she'd be late. The curtain can start at 8:10. It's okay. It's the same opera.
Well, there have been many shotgun weddings that have been precipitated by someone who discovered they were late, only to discover that they were actually early for childbirth. So it is probably not out of the question that is something that could have happened in that time. And, I don't know the exact timing that we're talking about here, when the King of Bohemia and Irene Adler were an item, but if Michael's supposition is true, if Irene Adler in fact was pregnant and did give birth and pass away, was the child actually Godfrey Norton's or the King of Bohemia's?
Yes. Well, that is certainly a question. And you touch on a very important point, or a good point here, about the timing of all this, which I will get to, because I've got my own little theory here, because I think that the beauty of this question is that it leads to an even greater question, and an area rich for speculation. But to close this part of it, the third essay that's relevant to this from this book is by Don Pollock, a great former editor of the Baker Street Journal, member of the Five Orange Pips. And he comes to the conclusion in his essay that Irene was bipolar. And he finds in the case evidence of this. For example, he says her threats with the photo really don't make any sense. I mean, she was apparently going to be married in a day, and the king was going to be married shortly. Why did she bother to get up in male costume to do this? Why did they flee at 5 o'clock in the morning to the continent? All of that, he says, makes no sense. So there you have it. You've got sort of a landscape of three stakes in the ground. One is the whole ceremony was forced and maybe a fake, and maybe Irene was mocking Sherlock Holmes. Second, it was really important because Irene was expecting, and sadly she and the baby did not survive. And the third is, Irene was bipolar and had a series of strange actions here, and that's really what's going on. Well, look, I have an approach here, but you comment now.
Me? I haven't the slightest. Like I said, I had never even considered this as an issue before Ellie put it to our mind. So tell me, what's your angle, oblique or otherwise?
Well, look, you have to start with the case of all things. Now, Irene is about 30, give or take, when we hear the reference about her in Holmes's index. She's clearly an artist who's had some success. And our friend Terry Hunt, in a book that we've discussed on our other podcast, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, referring to my notes, Terry has an essay originally given at Chautauqua and now expanded, where he talks a little bit about her repertoire, what she would have sung as a great contralto. So this is a successful 30-year-old American contralto, an artist, hardly a woman of the world, but because of her skills as a singer and her talents as a trained actress, she's experienced the world, experienced Europe. It's likely that she was certainly dazzled by the King of Bohemia, who is presented as a very dramatic figure. And here she is. We find her retired at this early age. She's living in London. We learn that she goes out every so often, sings at concerts. And she has this picture. So let's look at this from Irene's perspective. I mean, Holmes says early on in the case, when he sorts through all these details, he says to the king, well, the photograph must be recovered. And the king says, well, I've tried. Now, bear in mind, her engagement with the king, her connection to the king, is 5 years old. So clearly they had some sort of affiliation, a romance, an engagement, a relationship that began 5 years previously. And we know that she's about to get married to Godfrey Norton. Now, she clearly didn't meet Godfrey Norton last week. Here she is in London. She's retired. going out from St. John's Wood, taking a drive, singing at concerts. So clearly her relationship to Norton, which must support marriage, is clearly probably a year or more old, right? Okay. So the king says, well, we've tried and failed to get the photograph. She won't sell it, so we've been after her, to buy it with increasingly high amounts. He says 5 attempts have been made, we can infer, to steal it. Oh, 5 attempts have been made. Twice. The king goes on. The king goes on and says, well, twice burglars have ransacked her home, says the king. Oh, he says, once we diverted her luggage. And twice, he says, she's been waylaid.
Well, wait, maybe that's why she was pregnant.
So,
she was waylaid.
So here is the king who says, yeah, I met this person 5 years ago, and, we've had this romantic entanglement, and she has this picture, and I've tried to buy it, and she won't sell, and I've, made 5 different attempts, and I haven't been able to move her. So I sent burglars into her house twice, and once, by the way, I stole her luggage, and then twice, I grabbed her somewhere. She's just been waylaid and searched by people. Now, if you were Irene Adler, this opera singer, if I were you, I would be quite inclined. I mean, if you had a relationship with a woman, let's say, in 2017, that was 5 years ago, and now in the last 2 years, people have been after you to sell her photograph. They've been after you 5 different times. Burglars have been into your house twice. They stole your luggage has been stolen once, and twice you've been kidnapped. I don't think it's at all unreasonable that you would want to get out of London.
Oh, those could have been coincidences.
And bear in mind, it's only the king who says, it's only the king who says, rather than see me marry another, she would do this terrible thing of sending this photograph to my beloved. But I think the real story here, so I think there's plenty of evidence for her wanting to get out of London. Now, in terms of Godfrey Norton and getting married, I think that is the real question here. Who is Godfrey Norton? How did they meet? We know he's remarkably handsome. Holmes says he's dark, aquiline, mustached, dashing. And we find out from Irene in her own note that this decision was a decision they both made. So it was after the events at Bryony Lodge that, in fact, after she said, "Good night, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she went immediately to the temple and talked to Godfrey, and they both came to the conclusion that the best resource was flight. So they got on this 5:15 a.m. train for the continent. And then I think the question is, well, now clearly you could speculate and come up with a backstory about Godfrey Norton and how they met and what that relationship was like and so on and so forth. But where did they go? Where would a retired opera singer go with a British barrister? Now Godfrey, after all, is a courtroom lawyer. John Linsenmeyer tells us he's a courtroom lawyer. So where are they going to go? There they are on the continent. They're on this train, 5 o'clock in the morning, headed for the continent. Obviously, well, I would think anyway, obviously, they would go to some outpost of the empire. I mean, they're not going to, to hide away somewhere. They would go someplace where Godfrey could be expected to practice his position. And so they would clearly go to some outpost of the empire where the British legal system would be relatively familiar. So they could go to Australia, they could go to Hong Kong, they could go to New Zealand, they could go to Malta, they could go to North America, they could go to Canada, which at least would be close to where Irene was born. And then the question is, so if they were really married, which we must take, that I choose to take that they were married, they might have had a child. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about Irene Adler's progeny. And if you look at famous births around those days, so Andy Peck in Bohemian Souls tells us this case happens on March 20th, 1889. 9 months later takes us to December 1889. So if you look at birthdays, from December to January 1890, let's say, and find out who's been born. Well, in January 1890, Charles Scribner III of the publishing family was born. That's very interesting, but not particularly relevant. The 13th Justice of the Supreme Court, Frederick Moore Vinson, was born in January 22nd, 1890. Would be a very interesting fellow to descend from a lawyer. But I have a suspicion here that it didn't write down the actual date here, did I, in my scribbling? But also born around that time in January of 1890 was Gunther Edward Arnold Schneider. He had a love of acting. He appeared on stage as Lorenzo in The Merchant of Venice at age 12, under the stage name of Edward Arnold. He was the first to portray Nero Wolfe in 1936 with Lionel Stander as Archie. And so I would submit that the child of Godfrey Norton and Irene Adler is actually Nero Wolfe.
There you go. That was a roundabout way of getting there. Well, look, we've discussed more preposterous things in this episode, so why not that? Why not that, indeed?
Preposterous, I think. You have to edit that out and put in the word proven.
Proven.
What do you mean?
Proof positive. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, there's so much to go on and yet so many gaps that we can fill in here. I think the one thing that remains to be certain is that Irene Adler certainly did find a man that would fill a gap for her. As she said, I'm loved. I love and am loved by a better man than he, referring, of course, to the king as he. And toward the end of her missive that she left for Sherlock Holmes, I don't know if you're aware of this, Bert, but she basically told, or very specifically told, the King of Bohemia to drop dead. She still did harbor a grudge, even though she was willing to give up her claim on the photograph. She said, as to the photograph, your client may rest in peace. An interesting message there, both ensuring the king that he had nothing to fear and telling him to drop dead at the same time. You never know.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot.
Indeed. Well, to reward our listeners for sitting through all of this, we do have that drawing that we promised you. This is for all of our Trifle patrons on Patreon. And again, just check the show notes for a link to our Patreon. We have a number of people lined up. We're going to pull out the prize wheel and give it a big spin. Watch it go around and see which number it magically and randomly lands on. And, oh, will you look at that? I don't think we've ever done this before. It's number 1. Number 1. And that means our winner this time is Matt Hall. Matt, congratulations to you. We will be sending you a mystery pack of Baker Street Journal back issues. So glad you could support us. So everyone else, please be like Matt. Be a winner. Be a supporter of Trifles on Patreon. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Drive like the devil. Church of St. Monica, Edge Railroad. I must arrive there at least 5 minutes before 12. That gives you 20 minutes. Half a guinea if you do it.